coercive control ends up being this pattern of behavior that creates and instills fear or harm in a person. And over time, that creates really lasting effects and impact. And I feel like it's one of the most sophisticated forms of abuse because you can't see it.
Welcome to LUXEtalk, where we talk purpose, positivity, and all things luxury. I'm your host, Lisa Berg, and today we have with us Christine Dillard. And Christine is a Fortune 500 director and the author of the debut memoir, The Truth She Showed Me. Drawing from her personal experience surviving coercive control and gaslighting, she provides firsthand insight into psychological abuse, trauma recovery, and personal autonomy while actively raising awareness and supporting healing for survivors. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you on here today. So, can you share with the audience where you kind of started with all of this and give us a background on what it is that you do?
Yeah. So my current state is I'm 2.5 years outside of my marriage. The divorce was filed 2.5 years ago. And I was married for a total of 17 years. Got married pretty young, 23-ish. And he was about 9 years older than I was. During that marriage, there were a lot of things that I subconsciously, I think, and maybe even sometimes consciously thought were a little bit off. But I went into that marriage and went into that relationship just like everybody does. They had down this path of, you're looking not to fail at these things. You're looking to make the best of the situation you're in. And so for a lot of years, that's what I did. And sometimes that was lying to myself. Sometimes it was lying to the people around me about what was happening. Most of the time it was about lying to people around me about what was happening. And then as I started to get towards the end of that 17-year relationship, so the last 3 or so years I spent working on that exit strategy to leave. That 3 years was an awakening period for sure. It started fairly slowly with I'm going to leave because I don't want the rest of my life to look like this. And I don't want my children to see or expect that this is what love is supposed to feel like or what a relationship is supposed to be. And so I spent 3 years kind of building that plan and path out. There were some nuances. Everybody's favorite question is, why didn't you just leave? If it was that bad, why didn't you just leave? And the reality is it's never that simple. When there are kids involved, even when there aren't kids involved, there's so much that happens in the relationship dynamic and the way that you're manipulated that it becomes impossible in a lot of cases to leave and to leave safely for that matter.
Right.
I spent 3 years or so working on the financials and working on everything that I had control of, at least in those moments, while I waited for my youngest to turn 12. It was kind of a landmark age in my state where the court will finally maybe listen to the opinion of a child in custody situations. So I was really waiting kind of for that landmark to hit before I exited with the kids. And following that departure from the marriage, I found myself a lot of days questioning, like, was it that bad? Was it really abuse? I wasn't really ready to say it was out loud yet. And I definitely was not a fan calling myself a survivor or a victim. And so I spent some time working through a lot of that. And I kept thinking, if I'm asking myself these questions and I'm actively healing in this journey, there will come a day when my kids are going to be working through this same journey and wondering the same things. And I wanted them to have some documentation of, what they'd lived or some validation of the experiences that they had. And that's it started as a journal and then over time evolved into The Truth She Showed Me, which is a book that is designed to help people recognize what coercive control looks like, both from the inside and the outside. My goal was, or my, purpose, mission maybe was, or hope was that I could help one woman just feel validated by reading it. And it's far exceeded my expectations on that front so far. But I've had a lot of feedback from parents who've read it who said, I don't have anything to compare it to. I had no context. And now I know what to watch for. And it steps you through like the journey that I took to get out in that 3 years. And then what it looks like on the other side, which isn't always pretty either. Did you feel?
Yeah. So did you feel, Christine, like when you were in that situation, I've heard it described as like the battered wife syndrome, like, oh, they're going to change, they're going to get better, they're going to do all these different things, and you fall into the pattern of hoping that things will change. And then again, falling into almost like that mindset of what did I do to deserve this? Or, all the different emotional things that play into that when you're in that type of a relationship. And did you feel that in your situation?
I did. I think I married hope, the person I hoped he'd be, not the person he was. And repeatedly, he showed me the person he was. And I wasn't willing to accept that because I thought I could fix him. I thought I could help him. And the reality of that is not true. And it took a long time to recognize and acknowledge that. And you do work through the motions of, because you're trying to constantly appease this person and make their life better and easier and make them happy, you over time, put all your needs aside and assume responsibility for absolutely everything, from arguments to laundry being dirty to, the lawn not being mowed, whatever's going on with the children. You start to assume every single task, responsibility, everything. And with that, you lose your entire self.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I can relate with this stuff more than you know. I also have come out of relationships that have been that way, and it is no easy task whatsoever. And then just finding yourself again afterwards and trying to figure out that new normal, and realizing that no, it was not your fault, and all the things that go into that too, Christine. So,
Yeah, and there's pieces of that you really have to dig deep on, right? Like if you're working through therapy, you start to have to ask some really deep questions about like what a trip. Like I can't control his behavior, and I'm not responsible for that. But why did I attract that person, and why did I accept the things that he was doing for even in the early days, right? I mean, there's an argument that once you're in it, there's some manipulation that happens that keeps you engaged, right? But before that, there were clearly red flags, and so I was not only drawing him in, but also I just let things slide. And why did I not have enough self-respect or self-love to address those early on or to walk away?
hmm and it's also one of those things too that starts slowly, right? Like it starts out very slowly and progressively gets worse. It's not like it starts out where all the red flags show. You walk away from that in a minute, right? But it's slowly and progressive. And yeah, it's crazy how all that manipulation just escalates over time, and you don't even realize that you're in it until you're on the other side of it, really realizing, how bad it was.
Yeah. And they have you in a position where, because you constantly question your sanity because they're pushing you with a different narrative all the time, you work through those moments on the other side where you're still even asking yourself, like, again, like, was it that bad? Is, and then you see other people's stories, and then you're like, well, it wasn't that bad. And so if it wasn't that bad, was it really? And that back and forth, I mean, you've learned now to not even trust your own instinct. You've learned to not trust your own body. And I think that was the easiest thing the learning the signals from my body was the easiest thing to turn back on and to recognize in the moment, because it was like tangible. So now that I know that, my heart starts racing when somebody raises their voice, I know my body doesn't feel safe. And so I grounded myself a lot of times in the healing process with things like that, because I didn't trust just like the conscious thought of, oh, I don't feel safe. I didn't trust myself enough to do that. So I had to lean on the body.
hmm So, what do you think, with that being said, is the difference between like what someone would consider traditional abuse and coercive control?
A lot of times when we talk about traditional abuse, it is physical in nature. At least that's how we recognize it, right? It's bruises, it's broken bones, it's threats about harming a person. It's those type of things. Whereas coercive control ends up being this pattern of behavior that creates and instills fear or harm in a person. And over time, that creates really lasting effects and impacts, right? Like there's a lot of information out there around the CPTSD that follows situations like this where you're exposed to long periods of this type of abuse. And it can be everything from, you know, for like the entire relationship, managing or controlling finances, not allowing you to spend money, not allowing you to have access to money because you might leave, right? If I control your access, you don't have money, you're not going anywhere. You have nowhere to go. It shows up in the form of isolation. They start to nitpick your friend group and the way you act with friends, to the point where you will start to pull back from those friends because it's easier than dealing with him in the fallout of seeing those friends. Same thing happens in, like the family relationships. You'll start to pull back in those areas too. So it surfaces in a lot of different ways, and it's super complex. And I feel like it's one of the most sophisticated forms of abuse because you can't see it. And so, even when it does escalate to the point where they're threatening you, it's still, unless they wrote it down and send a message to you, it's still he said, she said. I mean, there were days, and I don't know if you've experienced this too, but there were days I just prayed when we fought that he'd hit me because I knew if I had a black eye, nobody would question my leaving. But if I just said, oh, he's mean to me, because that's what I considered it back then, right? Before I could see the whole pattern. Now, I mean, they're like, you chose this life, you picked this person, you committed to this relationship for better or for worse, right? And the reality is there's a point where it doesn't have to be for better or for worse because we don't need to be there for the worst.
Right, right. And I think you hit on that too. When you have a controlling relationship, they do try to keep you away from the rest of your world. They try to keep family and friends and everything that's safe and something that is familiar. They literally try to isolate in a situation to where you feel like you've lost everything about yourself. And then you're like, who even am I anymore?
Yeah.
And then at that point, you're so trapped that kids involved, whatever else. Now, what do you do? So I am glad to hear that you made it on your way out of there and have turned something that was ugly and awful into helping other people. That is, that's wonderful that you were able to do that.
Thank you. It's been powerful seeing the survivor community out there and the way that they come together as a collective to support other people and to share information on platforms like this or in other community groups. It's amazing to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that, like, when it came time to make these decisions, your physical intuition, I mean, obviously it's going off for quite a while before you actually pulled the trigger, but can you share with the audience too, with anybody that's kind of going through that, how they can kind of navigate that?
I'll tell you, if you are not listening to your body today, your body will start getting louder. It starts with handshaking. It starts with racing. It starts with a tight chest and sore muscles and a headache and not sleeping well, right? And it evolves into things like blood pressure problems and anxiety sometimes and autoimmune diseases. But it
Mhm.
escalates if you're
Oh,
not
yeah.
conscious of it, right? That's really where the title of my book came from. I originally had named it The Lies She Told Me because I was so mad at myself for lying for so long to myself
Hmm.
that I started with that title. And then the further I got into my writing, the more I realized that she had been telling me all along. I just wasn't listening.
Right.
And over time, she showed me the truth of the situation I was in. And it really came down to being grounded in understanding that those heart racing moments and the shaking hands and the way I braced when he came through the door, the way the kids would change when he was there or wasn't there, right? Their entire persona would change. And those type of physical signs were the, again, easiest to ground in because I could trust those. And there's research to back those up too. So there's that validation component that a lot of times we need coming out of these situations. I totally lost track of your question, but that's where I grounded myself in those last several years.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. So when, sharing with the audience different things that they can do, if someone feels like they are at the critical stage of leaving, what would you give them as far as safe steps to take to basically make that exit? I mean, do you have any insight on that as far as, women or men, what they could do if they catch themselves in this situation?
If you start to find yourself, or if you recognize yourself now in this situation, right, documentation will be the most powerful thing you have in the end, especially if you have to go to court. So begin documenting the behavior that you're seeing, but do it safely. Do it in a hidden app. Do it do it in a notebook he doesn't have access to. But start documenting those things, the things that feel off to you, even if they seem small, because that's going to help you recognize the pattern that shows up over time. I would also recommend that you reach out to some of the resources that are available, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, local community resources. A lot of those resources are confidential and can advocate and support you without anyone else, having insight. For me, I never thought it would be safe to talk to friends or family about it because I didn't want to risk someone slipping up and hinting that I was leaving, especially since it took so long. So until I was out, everyone found out when I filed for divorce. When he found out, they found out. So keep it quiet. It's safer that way for everybody. Find the one or two people you can share with. For me, it was a lawyer and a therapist. They were the only two people who knew. There's safety in having a plan, and there's empowerment in just saying I'm gonna make a plan, even if you can't leave for 3 or 5 years from now, right? Because of kids or other things. Just telling yourself I'm going to leave because I won't live my life this way forever gives you just one little nugget of empowerment, and then that will start to multiply because now you're going to start stocking away $5 here and $5 there, and you're going to start making little decisions where you're investing in yourself and not him. And again, that becomes like just this multiplier of empowerment. And again, the documentation is probably the most powerful thing you can do, especially if you're building a plan around custody and you're going to have that battle ahead of you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think, you know, when you talked earlier about too, when there are kids involved, you know, because someone from the outside can easily say, well, why didn't you just leave? You could have just, it's really not that easy. And I think that people who have not been in that situation can't grasp it. So I'm really happy to hear that you were able to just formulate a plan that was safe for you and, you know, again, turn something that was so ugly into an opportunity to use your voice to help other women who are caught in a same situation or struggling with some sort of abuse that they feel like there's no way out because there is always a way out.
Yeah, for those that are, like, still struggling to grasp the whole, like, "Well, so what? There's kids, like, just tell the court." The reality is, if you lose a custody battle and you're sharing 50-50, the reality of that situation is that parent now is no longer with their children 24/7 and cannot protect them in the same way they could if they were in the same household. That's why people stay. That's why parents stay. You're not gonna hand your kids off if you can't protect them for a weekend or a week or multiple weeks over the summer. You're not going to do that. It's too risky.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a very, very good point that I'm sure a lot of people don't look at from that angle unless they've been involved with it directly themselves. So, talk to us about your book, The Truth She Showed Me. Can you give us a little bit more insight into that and kind of what it goes over and what it does?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a 7-part component to it. And in the very beginning, it starts with, actually, let me back up for just a second. If you're going to read it, it's a super immersive reading experience. So if you've lived this situation or if you're in it right now, like fair warning, it can bring out a lot in people because you get the language, you get the feelings, you get everything that's somatically kind of happening with me in the moment as I'm experiencing each thing. So there are very specific stories throughout the years that I started sharing in this process. The opening scene is kind of one of it was the last straw, and it was when the anger reversed and it went from being directed at me to being directed at my son, and I could no longer protect him. There was a day where the anger was my ex was so consumed by anger that day that I could not redirect it. And it was the first time that had ever happened. And it scared me to death. So I open with that, but then I kind of back up a little bit and I go back to the very beginning because if I go back even to our first date, you're going to see some trends and patterns in the way that he talked to me, the way that he made decisions, the way started making decisions. And you start to see those realizations very early in the book. It has a 3-part voice within it. There's the survivor, there's the mother who's living in those moments, and then there's the sovereign, the one that's kind of seeing it from the other side. And at the end of each movement, or each of these 7 movements, there's a section that is dedicated to just reflection. So depending on where you're at in your journey, whether you've lived it, are living it, or are planning to leave, you've kind of recognized that you need to go. There's a series of questions that just help to maybe ground yourself, especially if you're still questioning things. Like, was it bad enough? Did it really happen? They were tools that I used in my journey. A lot of them I used really quickly afterwards, but wish I would have had it at the beginning. And so as you move through the book, you get into the part where I start to plan out the exit and you get some insight into what that took and the setbacks that I encountered along the way. It was everything from financial stuff to health insurance and trying to keep the kids in the home and the schools and with their friends so that we didn't have to like disrupt everything. There's some realizations that happened throughout that too. I spent 3 years trying to keep their life entirely intact. And the biggest component of that was the home and being able to sustain the home without him. And, in hindsight, I maybe didn't need to do that. I don't think it would have impacted the kids negatively had I just left. But again, that age, my youngest came into play pretty heavily there. So there's some give and take with that. But you get into, as we move into the latter movements, the healing process and what it took, the different modalities that I leveraged from traditional therapy to trauma therapy, Reiki energy healing, kind of a combination of things that I think they worked for me. So I share that because I think sometimes there can be a stigma around therapy. But I talk about a couple of not so great therapy experiences too. There's a lot of reality within this. There's a lot of recognition of my part in enabling him, whether I was trained to enable him or not. There's recognition of what I contributed to this. And in the very last couple of movements, I talk about future relationships and what it looks like when you start to encounter things that you didn't know existed. You walk away thinking, "Oh, I'm in a really good spot. I feel at peace. I'm really doing great." And then you enter a relationship and realize, "Oh, there are so many things that I have not experienced yet again that now I have to work through." So it starts to step you through that too.
That's wonderful. So it sounds like, you spoke your truth, you spoke up, you acted on it. And how do you think that that has shaped you as far as where you are now in leadership roles?
I think that it has opened my eyes. One of the things that I talk about quite a bit is the dual reality that I lived during that time, because I was always in corporate America and had this perception or persona that I lived 8 to 5. And then I go home and be this other person, and nobody knew that. And so when I released the book in April, a big moment for me was putting that on LinkedIn and releasing it there, because no one in my world knew the things that were in this book. They didn't know. And as it was liberating, probably one of the most freeing things I've ever done, because I got to bring the two women together and I could just be the one woman. There was an outpouring from my network, people on my team, people within the company I work for now, companies I worked for in the past, that came forward and were sending me messages like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea. Some things now make sense." But then also they shared their stories and they opened themselves up. So it created this kind of chain reaction that I am super proud of. People sharing their stories and being willing to talk about their experiences, even if it's one on one. Like not everybody has to be, no, not everybody has to do this. And this wasn't on my bingo card either. But I think the more we talk about it, the more real it becomes for everyone else in the world, the lawmakers, the judges, and the public for that matter. Like we start to educate the people around us to be able to recognize things differently and to recognize it for what it is.
I think that's so good. And, you touched on another point there too, where no one in your immediate world knew what's going on, but that is the whole thing of abuse, right? Like when someone is in that, because they don't know how to handle it, because they don't know what to do with it, because it's just too much for them to even wrap their head around themselves, they keep it to themselves rather than sharing it or asking for help, or doing all the things that people from the outside might be like, "Well, why didn't you?" Well, this is why, right? Because there's a
Yeah.
lot of other moving parts in it. And like you also said too, denial is a huge thing. Like you
Just
mentioned, what did I do? Or am I overreacting? Or is this? And the answer to that stuff is no, because if your internal body is going off, your spidey senses are saying, "Hey, this doesn't feel right." I mean, when your body does that, things usually are not right. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's so true. And that vulnerability that comes out when you start to talk about these things, I have found has become a little bit of a strength, because it added a level of humanity that I didn't have before, because I was so guarded in my leadership roles, because I've tried to keep those things so separate. But yeah, you're totally right. The shame and the doubt that comes with it keeps you quiet, and they bank on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, you having again a voice and speaking up in your story makes other people way more comfortable in coming out and feeling like I'm not alone in this situation. But it starts with one, and then there's others that follow. But sometimes you have to be the strong voice to speak the uncomfortable, to speak the unthinkable, and kind of hit on those taboo things that are kept so quiet for so long by people that are currently suffering, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because in that world, when you're living in it, you feel so alone. And sometimes there's like, that there's no other outlet, right? Like you can't talk to anybody. And that isn't going to change overnight. And so if we can if we can create ways like with podcasts and books and things like that to allow people to feel a little less alone in those times, they might find that strength that they need or that one little nugget of information that will just make things click for them to be able to leave. So I'm on all the different social platforms at The Truth She Showed Me. Highly recommend, if you don't follow that, follow some of the communities that are out there for survivors. Even if you're just going to be a silent observer, you'll find a lot of validation in hearing other people's stories. And that's a really great place to start.
Thanks for listening to Lux Talk, where faith leads, luxury inspires, and life is elevated. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, and share it with someone navigating all things luxury. For more luxury insights, market education, and elevated conversations, follow Lux Talk, turn on notifications, and join us for what's coming next. Stay elevated, stay informed, and stay connected with Lux Talk.